So, today we are talking about succession. All right, give you the definition, kind of start us off strong. Ecological succession is a series of more or less predictable changes that occur in a community over time. So, predictable is a really big key term here. Essentially, accession is how a community goes from little to nothing to like a full blown interactive ecosystem over the course of a couple steps. And those steps happen in a variety of ecosystems, regardless of the climate. So, little key tidbit. So, we're going to put a little star by it. Ecosystems change over time. There really is no such thing as an ecosystem that remains to be the same as time progresses. There are always changes, whether that be really, really big changes or really, really small changes that happen over time. It's never going to be the same. If you go out into the woods now and you go out into the woods 6 months from now, or if you go out into the woods 3 years from now, it's going to be different. It's never going to be the exact same ecosystem. Especially after disturbances. As some species die out and new ones move in. When I say disturbances that happen in an ecosystem, that could be anything from a lumber company coming in and clearing out a forest for wood. It could be the wildfire that started in California. It could be a farmer plowing a field in order to start his or her their, I guess, farming endeavors. It could be a tsunami wiping out an entire beach line. Disturbance can be anything from human centered to just something that happens naturally. So, there are two types of succession: primary succession and secondary succession. So, we are going to start out with primary succession. Primary succession happens in an area where there are no remnants of a previous community. Begins in an area where there are no remnants of a previous community. We are talking only rock left behind. There is no soil, there are no microorganisms. We've got flat, barren rock. Examples? So after a volcano eruption, or like a retreating glacier. As glaciers melt or move, they kind of wipe out everything in their path. So retreating glaciers can leave only rock behind, and volcanic eruptions will just spew molten rock everywhere and just create a layer of flat, barren rock. And that is the stage on which primary succession happens. A key term when it comes to primary succession is a pioneer species. Just like a pioneer is someone who goes to a new undiscovered land and begins life there, a pioneer species is a species that moves into an area where there is nothing and starts the process of life, starts the process of primary succession. So, a pioneer species is the first species to colonize a barren area. Our example, right, is lichen. Lichen is one of those things that you will see just growing on flat rocks, and they're one of the few species that can grow and get nutrients from those rocks. Lichen is a symbiotic relationship. We talked about symbiosis last week. What's an example of a symbiotic relationship? Give me one. I heard something. One of our three examples. Talked about symbiosis. Parasites? Yeah. What? Algae? Yeah. Mosses. All right, cool. So, lichen is a symbiotic relationship between fungi and algae that grows on barren rock. Do you think this relationship is commensalistic, mutualistic, or parasitic? They're fungi and algae living together in order to grow on barren rock. Mutualistic? Why? Because they both benefit. There's the algae carries out photosynthesis. They are typically photosynthetic. Those will kind of create the nutrients that the fungi will need, and the fungi kind of provides a place for that algae to grow. So, this kind of symbiotic relationship fixes nitrogen to be used by other organisms when you guys talked about the nitrogen cycle, talked about nitrogen fixing bacteria and how they allow the chemical process to take place where nitrogen goes from an unusable form to a usable one. So this kind of symbiotic system is able to take that nitrogen out of the rocks, out of the air, and create a store of nitrogen for other organisms to use. They also break down rock, which adds organic material to form soil. Before we can get actual plants, our primary producers, before we can get those things that come in and feed off the primary producers, we have to have soil. And in primary succession, we're starting out with barren rock. So the first step in primary succession is getting the organisms that are able to break down that rock and create soil, either from the slow wearing down of that rock or as the lichens die and kind of decompose. That organic matter doesn't settle immediately into the rock. It can just sit there and kind of form a preliminary soil. So, pull up a photo example. All right. All right, so in a primary succession, we are starting out with bare rock, either from glaciers or volcanoes or something equally as disastrous. Where'd my marker go? Oh. So we start out with bare rock. We get our pioneer species like our moss or our lichens. As that moss or those lichens grow, they eventually die. And that decomposition creates a thin layer of topsoil. Really, really easy to live grasses will kind of grow and take those pioneer species and those dead pioneer species and use them as nutrients. And eventually that will break down and form an even thicker layer of topsoil until eventually enough nutrients are put into the ground that we can have our shrubs and trees. And with those shrubs and trees come all the little living active mammals and insects that can feed off of those trees and kind of form their houses there. Any questions about primary succession? Then we will move on to secondary succession. Secondary succession isn't as extreme as primary succession. Essentially, communities aren't always completely destroyed by disturbances. Secondary succession happens faster than primary succession because the soil survives the disturbance. So, communities aren't always completely destroyed by disturbances. Sometimes soil is left behind. secondary succession happens faster. So, in primary succession, we are starting off with rock. There is nothing around. In secondary succession, we have that soil left behind. We have some of our microorganisms there still. We might even have a couple of grasses or shrubs. And because this soil survives the disturbance, new and surviving plants can grow rapidly. New and surviving plants grow rapidly. This often happens after wildfires, hurricanes, deforestation, farming, anything that will destroy the natural community that exists in an area but leave the topsoil behind. So, this secondary succession is kind of pretty topical right now because we have a huge wildfire in the West. So, secondary succession, we'll see a wildfire happens, scares off or kills all of the existing organisms in an ecosystem, and leaves behind nothing but topsoil. Maybe some of the bacteria that live in the topsoil. Within a year or two, we have our small grasses, our plants that come up every spring. Some of those seeds might have survived into the soil. 3 to 4 years, we get our multi-annual perennials, and then eventually into what they call an intermediate species, which is all the stuff that grows between our primary pioneer species and our climax community, which we will talk about in a moment. So, any questions about secondary succession? This isn't always a bad thing. When they're human caused and they get out of hand and they're really, really disastrous, then yeah, our ecosystems have a really, really hard time recovering from this stuff. But wildfires occur naturally. They're usually a lot smaller than we see now, partially because we've got really, really hot, really, really dry seasons, which creates a tinderbox, if you will, out of existing forests. So the wildfires we see aren't necessarily the ones that we'd expect to happen naturally, but some plant species require wildfires for their seeds to germinate. And a lot of times when they take into account, or when wildlife people try to stop wildfires from happening, there's such a big buildup of like all the dead trees and dead plants and dried up stuff at the bottom of the forest floor So when a fire does happen, it's way out of control. But if we get a couple little ones that just kind of clear a general area and die out really slowly, that's supposed to happen. That actually is healthy for a lot of ecosystems. So why does succession happen? Every organism changes the environment it lives in. From a single bacterium to a deer, there is some sort of impact on an ecosystem when an organism lives in it. Whether it be chemical or physical, every organism changes the environment in which it lives. As one species modifies an environment, it makes it easier for other organisms. Other species to compete for resources and survive. So let's say we've got this topsoil, right? And we've got our pioneer species. It's a population of nitrogen fixing bacteria. As that nitrogen fixing bacteria lives, it increases the nitrogen levels in the soil. By increasing the nitrogen levels in the soil, it has modified the environment to make it easier for another species that may need that nitrogen to get what it needs and survive. That graft may loosen up the soil a little bit and allow for seeds of a different species to take root and grow. So every change that happens because one species moves in can allow for another species to thrive. And once that thriving happens, we reach something called a climax community. This is what we would consider our normal communities, or what we would be trying to get back to after a disturbance. This, this is not always uniform and stable. And succession doesn't always take the same path. If a different pioneer species is introduced to an area, say 1,000 years ago, a specific area of California was cleared by a volcanic eruption, right? we had a lichen species colonize that and kind of create and set the state for our primary and secondary succession. Say recently, volcanic eruption happened again. Nothing but rock. If a moss species acts as our pioneer species, it can lead to a varied environment. Also, ecosystems are always changing, like we mentioned before. What one climax community looks like one day is not what it's going to look like the next. When it comes to succession after natural disturbances, we usually get secondary. Whoop. So, if a natural disturbance happens apart from, like we said, a glacier or a volcanic eruption, usually it's going to be secondary succession, wildfires, hurricanes, tsunamis, stuff like that. And this is normal and happens often. Like I said, it's almost required for some ecosystems to continue to survive. With human-caused disturbances, we might not be so lucky. The wildfires started by that gender reveal party last week. Did you not hear about that? Okay. And it was somebody had a smoke gun related gender reveal party in California, started a giant wildfire. That wasn't planned or prepared for by an ecosystem. It was much more dangerous than a naturally started wildfire could have been. If we clear a forest and create farmland, that farmland won't be as rich in nutrients as the soil was before we cleared it. So if after a human caused disturbance, we may or may not recover. Things like deforestation and farming change the microclimates of the soil. If we have a bunch of nitrogen-fixing bacteria naturally occurring in a forest, right? But we clear that forest and we start farming and we start using fertilizers, and those fertilizers have a lot of nitrogen in them. Those nitrogen-fixing bacteria aren't needed in that ecosystem anymore and can die out, which means that when it's no longer farmland and primary and secondary succession happen, we might not get those nitrogen-fixing bacteria back, which means it can't support the ecosystem that was originally there. Studying patterns helps us make comparisons. If two volcanoes erupt on separate coasts of Iceland, we got a west coast volcano and an east coast volcano. We got one in the middle, right? The one in the middle happened about 60, 70 years in the past. We can look at the pattern that it happened. If the west coast succession process is happening very, very similarly to the one that happened in the middle years and years ago, but the east coast one is looking a lot like what happened in Colorado, we can make predictions about about what would happen, about what those ecosystems would look like. Any questions about this? Okay, so there's a couple things. First and foremost, there is an exit ticket on Canvas, so you will have to fill that out so you can get your Chromebooks out. If you get done with that a little early, I want you to put some sort of rough sketch of primary and secondary succession in your notes. It doesn't have to be beautiful, it doesn't have to be perfect, but I want some sort of doodle differentiating primary and secondary succession. And then I don't think I did this with your class, so I'm going to talk about grades. Just one moment.